This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulke. Welcome back to our show. I am so glad to have Arthur Miller back with us. Arthur, there's some other things you were going to talk about, such as street closings, bicycle lanes, etc., etc.
Yeah, and thank you for having me back, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So, I mean, I will say, I did mention before that one has to look at the context of policy.
That's why there are so many initiatives to limit cars in favor of mopeds, bikes, street closes, sitting areas. What is this all about? Is it about climate change? Is it about something else? Who drafts these ideas?
Exactly. So and again, for the record, I'm multimodal. I live in the city. I drive. I take the train. I ride my bicycle. I'm a longtime bicycle rider, and I mean all over the city. And certainly, transportation policies have to be aimed towards safety and benefits for all. But what's been happening is I think that there's a lot of rhetoric that's being used to sell programs to benefit certain business models over the average people. And people need to be skeptical when they hear some of the rhetoric.
This is for you.
Exactly. I mean, that was one of my issues with congestion pricing, the vehement arguing against Governor Kathy Hochul and putting the pause on the congestion pricing, but also just trying to shout down any reasonable voices who said, let's go back and look at this, or press conferences and things. Anybody with an opposing opinion, they don't want people to be heard, and there seems to be this attitude of, we put all this hard work into creating this program. We did this for you. You're not doing what we told you is good for you. And I think that's one of the larger problems, both with congestion pricing, and I see this as a great opportunity, but also other areas. I think people have to be skeptical. At this point, when someone says it's about safety, when someone says it's progressive, when someone says it's equity, when someone says it's this and that, you have to look at who gains and who loses. And I think that's really the clear thing.
And who's saying it and who they represent.
Exactly. So you have advocacy groups that claim that they're all about safety, but what they really are is, the lion's share of their money, their financial support, comes from special interests, be they the personal injury lawyers, the venture capitalists who fund
get crowds out there to shout.
Exactly. And the real estate developers. I mean, I'm sort of I've been saying on social media and elsewhere that I believe it's sort of a troika of sort of three main parties who finance a lot of these things. The real estate developers generally want to use other people's money to fund their projects and they don't want to pay for the necessary infrastructure. That's number one. On development and things like that, they say, don't make us put in parking, for example, because in the future everyone will have an electric car or autonomous car. So if you don't make us put in parking, then we can put in more affordable housing. It's another buzzword to watch, affordable housing. The personal injury lawyers, very happy to talk about safety, but it's always everybody else's responsibility. In other words, no one is saying to someone on a bicycle, or I should say, you don't hear the messaging enough. Follow the traffic rules. Don't go against traffic. Don't wear headphones while you're riding. Things like, you don't hear that. They lobbied against having cyclists wear helmets. But they said because they think they'll discourage people from taking up bicycling. Either it's about safety or it's not. And who profits from that? The personal injury lawyers, who can gin up when they go to the jury. They say, well, it's always the bad trucks or the bad car's fault. It's never the poor victim. So again, that's about maximizing the profit for personal injury lawyers because they're not talking about the safety. And then, of course, I mentioned it's the venture capitalists who, not that that's a bad thing, but you have a lot of people over time who have, especially with the tax laws, there's a lot of cash around, interest rates were low, they were putting it into these startups that are particularly tech heavy, that will say, well, let's create a platform. You can order your food from an app. You can order a car from an app. We don't have to have an employee delivering the food or driving the car, and in the future it's going to be autonomous anyway. We're not even going to need them. So these are the models that are sort of being promoted. So now, who benefits by some of these programs? The people that can afford to still stay in these areas, who aren't going to be squeezed out by taking away parking, for example, or rising insurance costs, or things like that.
Or taking over 6-story buildings so they can build huge towers.
Right, absolutely.
Or taking over the areas where small businesses are conglomerated, you know, like repair shops, plumbing shops, et cetera,
exactly.
et cetera.
So, I mentioned during the break, I mean, this is, for me, and one of the reasons I got involved with this area is that in my neighborhood, they were looking to put in bike lanes down Queens Boulevard. And Queens Boulevard has this large median there. And what they wanted to do is put the bike lanes, take out parking on the sort of service roads of Queens Boulevard, which were all lined with small, low-rise, 1- and 2-story commercial properties that, in real estate parlance, they refer to them as taxpayers. The taxpayers generally a small property, somebody's owned the property for a while, they have a commercial tenant or two, they rent it out, and it's an investment. They profit obviously off the rising price, but they hold on to it, and then they make profits from the rents. Well, guess what? If you take away the parking and then start to change the zoning, what happens is you get empty stores, the owners can't rent those out, and then the developers swoop in and they say, this street happens to be near a subway that was already built, let's put in a high-rise, and you know, we can then rent out this apartment. So these things are being used to force changes in our neighborhoods. In my area in Forest Hills, I even said, why don't you put it in the median? And they had decided that that's what they wanted to do, and they claimed that they did studies, but they never made the studies available. So they basically sort of rubber stamped this program that they want to take the parking, they want to sort of change the neighborhoods in a way that will benefit certain interests. In other words, and they don't seem to listen to what the residents and others say. I noticed also around that time President Trump was in, and under President Trump's tax law, there was something called, there was some kind of community investment, there was some kind of tax break for redeveloping certain neighborhoods. So when the city released the list of the second areas where they wanted to build bike lanes, surprisingly they were all in these same, almost all of them were in these same zones that were targeted for development. These sort of, so I mean, to me it just seems very clear. One has to watch. You can't just pay attention to the rhetoric, you have to watch. But speaking of the rhetoric, back in my neighborhood, there were areas where they had, you know, painted bike lanes, but there were also areas where, let's say they had cars parked, but they painted a white line maybe 6 feet away from the car. But it didn't say it was a bike lane. And I know from working with the trucking industry, you're pretty much allowed to double park where there's no parking available, you know, except for Midtown Manhattan, as long as you're expeditiously making your delivery. Well, if you call it a bike lane, you're not allowed, you can't double park if an agent says you're in a bike lane. But if there's just like a white line that sort of steers traffic away, when there's no truck there or no one else double parking, it sort of seems clear to me that a bicyclist would go there. As a bicyclist, I would feel safe going through there. Mm-hmm. When I asked DOT why they didn't do that, and they said, well, we feel that cyclists will be more comfortable if it says it's a bike lane. I said, well, okay. And I got involved over time with some other groups that were dealing with bike lanes and some of these other issues where you had large organizations trying to take properties. There was a group in in Los Angeles, an area similar to Queens, where you had like an old boulevard that originally, I think there was a trolley line that went to the beach, and they also had these low-rise buildings, and they wanted to put a bike lane in. They wanted to take out the parking, and people there said, look, you got where the trolley line was. Why don't you put the bike lane there and then leave it so our customers can get to us? And they said, no, we think cyclists will feel more comfortable if they use these bike lanes. And I started to hear that word that. And in cities across the country, they said a lot of the designs for bike lanes was about comfort. No one's really talking about safety. Will it keep cyclists' safety? And guess what? The way a lot of these lanes have been designed, people are getting killed because they're in essence, the messaging is not that you have to be careful. You cannot pass on the right side. You cannot wear your headphones. There are mixing zones. There's always going to be a mixing zone. So some of these people, I think, are lulled into a false sense of security that the bike lane will keep them safe. But it's more about comfort and getting people to ride bikes rather than keeping them safe. And I really object to that messaging. People are getting hurt out there. And now with the advent of more of these electronic vehicles, some of these safety groups are lobbying, and by that I'm talking about the mopeds and the deliveristas and the quiet scooters and things like that. A lot of these groups are advocating for it, and there's finally a groundswell of saying, you know, if something's got a motor, it should have, the operator should be licensed. And I really think that's needed. There needs to be accountability for safety. What we have now, you know, here in mid-2024 is chaos.
Even a license, they you know, before, if you hit somebody, they right away before you can even look at their license.
Right.
And there's no one around who.
And they leave. I got
right.
involved with a group, I think the Electronic Vehicle Safety Alliance, something like that. It was large. Mm-hmm. There's over 70 people, I think, who were hit by these things. Some left. Lost their livelihoods and physically disabled because, and I think, you know, something like over 90% of the time, the people that hit them on an electronic bike or a city bike and things like that just sped off. There's no license plate. They're not trackable.
Even there was a license plate.
Exactly. So, and they're not required to have insurance. Mm-hmm. So, you know, and very interestingly too, I've pointed this out to some. And again, because I'm multimodal, I care about safety in general. Back in 2019, Governor Cuomo signed what's called, I forget the the name slipped my mind. But anyway, he signed a law, Brianna's Law, because some young girl was on a boat and was killed by some drunken I think jet ski or some boat operator. So the law the governor signed says that anyone who operates a watercraft, a motored watercraft, over the age of 16 has to have a New York State approved safety class and has to have a certificate on them. It's either stamped on their driver's license or they have to carry a certificate. And when Governor Cuomo signed that bill, he said, you know, with all of these motorized watercraft and things like that, it's become chaotic, and you know, we need to you know, hopefully honor that Brianna didn't die in vain. Well, you could substitute watercraft for two-wheeled vehicles and say the exact same thing. If it's got a motor, in my opinion, if it's got a motor, you need to have at least safety training and have some kind of ID so there's accountability. People should be demanding that. So it's hypocritical to excuse this. And so you have these same safety groups. Again, they're funded by the same parties that also fund the delivery apps and things like that, saying, oh, you know, it's the poor deliverista and this and that. But they wouldn't stand up for this poor deliverista if something happened to them. They would say that person's on their own. So they're really not about protecting them. So again, the takeaway is you really have to look who's saying what and why, and who benefits and who loses.
How about these street closures?
So again, interestingly, under the sort of Orwellian idea that closing streets is good for the community, in some instances it is on occasion, but not on a long-term basis. And again, the residents don't seem to have the say. It impacts people who are they have disabilities. It impacts deliveries. It impacts first responders, fire trucks,
They
and
don't know the thing
ambulances
is
from getting
necessarily-
through. So again, it's more about putting agenda first. Now, another interesting thing about the rhetoric, and I've gotten into that, a lot of these groups use studies that they claim will advocate for their position. And somebody sent me one once where they say, well, here's this study that shows when you close the street, it's good for business. So I looked at the study. You can find a lot of this stuff online. And their methodology, it was somewhere in Spain, and they said that they had closed the street, and what they did was they looked at credit card receipts, banking card receipts for the certain period, before and after. And they analyzed it, and they said, first of all, the bank card receipts went up, but it was during the same period when more and more people were using electronic cards, and that business receipts for some businesses went up. There's the catch. Some businesses. The some businesses were cafes and restaurants. The other businesses, offices, trades places, showrooms, stores, and things like that, went down. So just because it may be good for outdoor cafes does not necessarily mean it's good for the neighborhood. So again, we all have to be very skeptical. We don't seem to have, we've been so disenfranchised. You have City Hall making decisions for us. You have community boards that are just appointed, that they're not directly elected, and a lot of them have been populated by some of these very people that are tied to the special interest groups. They are basically trying to shut down streets in many areas, or take away parking because it benefits certain groups over others.
Zoning and rezoning.
In a way, similar thing. The rhetoric there is affordable housing. Well, who could be against that? But this sort of willy-nilly saying, let's change neighborhoods, let's change the zoning. I think people should have a right to. The funny thing is the rhetoric is they say that people should have a right to do what they want with their property. But if you create the financial inducement to make people, let's say, sell out or raise the prices so that no one can buy a house, let's say, because its best use is going to be an apartment building instead of a private house, you've then changed the whole complexion of the neighborhood. And why does somebody buy or commit to moving into a certain neighborhood? Because there's something about that neighborhood that they wanted to see. If it's all going to be changed to high rises or something else, that may not be the same neighborhood they want.
A beautiful example is what happened where the Hudson Yards was.
Exactly.
That was an area where you had small shops, repair shops, plumbing shops, car repair shops, etc. I could go on and on, really. And some very small businesses who don't group together and speak out and advocate for themselves. So basically, they were the first victims. And then they creeped north and east, taking down the smaller office buildings.
Correct.
And to put up instead these 50, 60-story buildings in the name of, shall we say, skyscrapers for, say, Apple, for example, but it's not Apple, or Google, or whatever. Or for, and also just for people who, in the name of affordable housing, so they'll have like 30 apartments, which are supposedly affordable, that the poor guy can't afford.
Right.
So that they get tax breaks.
Exactly.
Going forward to 10 years. 10 years are up and no one notices that the tax break is no longer in effect.
Absolutely. But again, the developer made its money then is on to the next project.
Yes.
And which is, it's not a real plan for the continuity of New York. And to me, New York was a city of neighborhoods New York was a city where people could come in and afford, find a place to live and maybe start a business or something like that. It's become so unreachable. Part of that is general trends within the economy. I think I read somewhere where it was, back in the 60s, I think it would cost maybe 2 years' salary, the equivalent to buy a house. Now it's something like 6 years or that, so a lot of that is not just New York City's fault, but this rhetoric has been sort of weaponized to continue to cut people off from the avenues of, let's say, having families, creation of their own wealth. In other words, buying a house was like traditionally the major opportunity for middle class folks to obtain and build wealth for the future.
You become a slave to debt. You're no different from the slave.
Right.
You're indebted to the bank.
Exactly, and in a way, this is what happens. And getting even back to the congestion pricing issue, which is a large thing. It's almost the rich can pay. The average people, they'll just have to deal with it.
A very interesting thing happened this week. Mayor Adams has just commissioned a charter commission to revise the city charter. He had to meet the day after he announced this, and they were people he appointed, of course, and they are putting into effect a change to the city charter that will eliminate the city council and give him all the powers of the city council people. Isn't that cute?
That's crazy. I mean, I do think that the city council is a little bit out of control also. Maybe we need to sort of buy, a two-house legislature or something. But the money and the special interests have just taken such sway that we're really losing our city. And
Yes.
and it's a shame. And with the technology, people have the ability to go elsewhere. If it's cheaper, you could live. People can live in Nashville or this and that, and you work remotely in many instances. Which is why a lot of the places in Manhattan, the commercial places, are emptying out. So these are crazy times, given the technology and the changes. And we have to be very careful about what's being sold to us and why.
That's right.
So,
That's right. So what should we, aside from what you mentioned about being careful, what do you have any other recommendations for the ordinary citizen?
Well, definitely, if like they said after 9/11, if you see something, say something. It's very important to reach out to your elected officials and tell them that if you object to something or you'd like to see some change. They do listen. If you make phone calls or write letters, it's very, very important because they have to know. You can bet that the groups that are advocating certain positions, they're whipping up a frenzy to try to get their trusted people to talk. As a matter of fact, I'd mentioned this issue with Comfort. There was one town where they were worried about taking away bike lanes, and what they did when they first put them in, these advocates packed the board and threatened to vote. And when the town said, "Wait a minute, how did this happen?" And they said, "Let's do an actual survey," and then it flipped the opinion when they actually surveyed people who lived in the area. So always be mindful. You have a voice, you can use it, and stand up for what you
And
believe.
don't just make one phone call. Make repeated phone calls.
Absolutely.
Have your friends make some phone calls.
It's super important. So, in a way, that's why I sort of like talking about it, and I hope people can at least, when someone's trying to sell you something, you just watch what are the words, who benefits, who loses, how does it affect me. I think that not me personally, but how does it affect you? I think these are very important issues.
Yes. Back to congestion pricing. Is there anything special that you want to say?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what I find very interesting is that the City Council in 2000, around the year 2000 or so, voted against congestion pricing, but today they are for it.
Right.
I wonder what the effect of certain pressure groups have had on this opinion.
We could certainly speculate. You know, I have my opinion. I'm sure you do also, but the reality is, the way this was structured, it's not clear that it was going to not only to help congestion, but again, it seemed to favor certain winners and losers. And the concept of congestion pricing, if it works, especially now that you, here in 2024, when you can have a system that, let's say, can actually charge people at different rates depending on the time of day, it seems that this system was set up more as a money grab, just to get $15 billion in additional borrowing for the MTA, which incidentally, again, here in 24, the MTA said that this was just to plug the hole in their capital budget from 20 to 24, and that they expected to be back in Albany next year to be asking for yet more money for their capital improvements. So, in answer to your question, I think the concept of congestion pricing could work. The way it was done here in Manhattan was ridiculously unfair and irresponsible. I think it could, they keep saying it will improve the environment. I think it was very risky to the socioeconomic fabric. You know, if you get a family that say, I'm not going to come in to go to a museum, or if it's going to affect the theaters, or people saying I can't come and tend to my elderly relative, or it's going to interfere with my job, that's a huge problem. That's a huge problem, and they were just completely tone deaf. So separate congestion pricing from the debt scheme, and then let's come up with a better plan.
Yes. Arthur, I want to thank you so much for coming on my show.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure
You're
to
welcome.
be here, and thank you, viewers, for watching.
Till the next time, this is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.